Grioghair was kinsman his grandfather cousin to Sainid MacAlpin, Osrith found out that evening, as the monks brought the royal party food. She had been escorted from the outer monastery ground. Domhnall clapped Osrith on the shoulder in triumph as the warriors followed the nobles in for a supper prepared in humility for the journey ahead of Domhnall, across Myland to Alba's mainland, to Dunad. Osrith flinched in pain. The blow from one of the other warriors, the one she struck dead, had exacerbated her wound from 9 fingers from the man she had killed. She was aware Domhnall talking evenly and calmly, maybe even aware of how she was feeling, but it wasn't making any difference. Osrith had thought she was protecting the king-to-be, but instead these assailants turned out to be allies. And she had killed one of them, kin to Grioghair, Domhnall's once comrade in arms against the Norse in years past. Domhnall would speak to you about your actions tonight, Domhnall said, then saw the expression of horror on Osrith's face, which was illuminated by the many hundreds of candles still burning in the monastery's chapel, surrounding St. Comsill, no doubt. I killed a noble, Osrith murmured. And it could very well have been I, Domhnall replied. The day a warrior isn't to account for his conduct in the heat of battle will be a sad day for an army. How were we to know they were allies? Honest folk don't creep around in the dark. After another clap on the back, Domhnall strode into the monastery's hall, where they had eaten supper the night before, taking his place by Constantine and Domhnall, who was in animated, jovial discussion with his ally, his friend Grioghair MacDougall. Osrith trod the new straw lightly to where she saw Fergus and Tagged, eating fish and bread, the food prepared as a feast after the scent service, both warriors clearly relaxed and enjoying their repast. They welcomed Osrith, Tagged pulling a wooden plate across for her, and she smiled an unwilling smile as he put a portion of gigger onto it. The fire was banked with wood, and she could feel its warmth soothing her bones, which were stiff, not just from the cold. The monks, presumably having not finished the service due to the attack, continued addressing them in Latin. A huge Bible, the huge Bible, Osrith deduced, that she had seen them carry over to the chapel that morning. All heads turned to them, but she knew if she did, her eye would catch that of the would-be besieger of the monastery. Instead, Osrith wondered about her ancestor, as she wriggled against the wooden chair in which she was seated, though drier now. Her arms ached from wielding buoy in the wet as she had sought to keep her footing. St. Oswald had come when he had been in exile. Edwin, his mother's brother, inherited Northumbria's crown, and so Oswald had been exiled here, and asked for Ionan monks to establish Lindisfarina. Would it have been like this then? Nothing much could have changed. Her eyes drifted to the abbot, who was still reciting the book in front of him, and, as Osrith tried again to follow the words while nibbling at the seabird. But the nagging desire in her stomach about the man she had killed soured her will to listen more. As Grioghair raised a tankard of spirit, calling all to toast the future king of all Alba, Osrith slipped away. 88,888,888. Osrith had climbed the stable loft and thrown herself onto the straw, closing her eyes as the sound of merriment drifted through the evening mist up to the horse loft. She had only done her duty, fought for Domhnall, her lord sworn. It was a good point that Domhnall had made. He could very well have been this man's killer, not her, for Domhnall would not have known these men as allies. But the thought gave her little comfort as she remembered the look Grioghair had given her as she had left, one of pure loathing. Further, her shoulder, which had been injured in Doia, had been torn again as she had scrambled in the mud, and it was giving her pain. She closed her eyes. Poor sleep came to Osrith that night, and every twitching, scratching or scraping, from rodents, and from Tagged and Fergus retiring late into the night singing a song about sailing, awoke her from the sleep into which she did eventually fall. When finally the morning light appeared through the slats of the stable roof, Osrith bent and stepped over Tagged and Fergus, both of whom were snoring softly where they lay, clearly a good night. She needed to wash, she needed to look presentable. She needed to find Domhnall and speak to him. He must surely understand she was acting in good faith as he prayed to St. Comsill. The horse trough had been refilled that night by rainwater, so Osrith found a spot by the door and stripped to the waist, hoping that no monk decided to make an early morning visit to the stables. Her head ached, her shoulder more so, and she pulled a strip of linen that Ailey had given her when she was injured, for her leg, and unfolded it, dabbing it into the fresh water and over her shoulder, where she could feel a deep gouge of flesh, already beginning to heal. It would have healed faster with the ointment Betha had sold her, terebinth. Were she to find a healer again, Osrith determined to procure more. Where would Domhnall be? Osrith thought. She knew Constantine had a room which overlooked the west, for he had said he could see the harbour there, and the little boats in which they had travelled. Perhaps Domhnall's was nearer? As she dipped the fabric into the water once more, Osrith jumped as a hand took it from her own raised one. It was tagged. "You trod on me," he said, uncomplainingly. "I wondered where you were to." "To get dressed and find Domhnall," Osrith replied, as Tagged pressed the cloth to her shoulder blade. It felt good, Osrith thought, and he pressed it further up her shoulder along the wound. "Did I stand on anywhere important?" She glanced over her shoulder with a grin, and Tagged shook his head. "Just my arm, I have another," he quipped in return. Then, he bent past Osrith and squeezed the linen out into the water. "You need it trapped," he added. Osrith turned, as he strapped the strip under her armpit then around her shoulder joint. "You enjoyed the ale last night?" Osrith asked. "Monks make good ale," Tagged replied, as Osrith turned so he could make fast the bandage around her arm. Osrith felt Tagged's eyes light on her naked body and she suddenly felt self-conscious, her mind transported back to the beach when Nine Fingers tore her shirt away. Osrith had forgotten the warrior from Doia wasn't Finolai, who would happily help her with her clothing and was unconcerned at seeing her unclothed. It was for men, specifically Domhnall, who Finolai's heart yearned. She turned away as Tagged took his hands from her and back to her shirt, wetting and squeezing it quickly before strong, nimble hands came past her, patting the cloth carefully into the healing balm. Then, he helped her put her shirt over her head. "Do you know where Domhnall is?" Osrith asked, buckling on her sword, and stepping back a little. It was Tagged, from whom in 2 years she had never known anything other than filiality, but today, now, his touch repulsed her. "He is preparing to speak to us all this morning, didn't you know?" Tagged looked past Osrith and to the monastery's refectory, where they had partaken in the celebratory feast. His blonde hair, shoulder-length and tousled as a boisterous wind charged into the stable. "We are to go to Dund immediately. We must wait till we are summoned." With that, Tagged strode past Osrith and stood in the stable-yard momentarily, letting the wind whip past him before making his way in the direction of the kitchen. "Thank you," Osrith called to him, though she doubted he heard her. Then, she gave her arm an experimental twist. It still hurt, but the bandage was offering some support. Dread crept into her chest now, as the previous night's events crept over her again. She needed to see Domhnall, explain the circumstances. Maybe she could take heart in the fact that he hadn't detained or imprisoned her. Osrith found her fears were soothed when she began to take to foot, pacing a large route inside the monastery, past the pig pens, now empty as the late autumn slaughter and harvest had already passed. She trod through the mud to the outer gate, the monks on the ramparts nodding down to her as she passed by. They had fought as well as Domhnall's warriors, Osrith thought, as brave as the monks in Comsil's monastery at Doia, their ferocity was keeping the Norse at bay. Yet the men ambushing the monastery last night had slipped past them. She walked towards the harbour as last night's battle replayed again behind her waking eyes. How could she have known? If you hadn't wanted to risk being fought by guards, why sneak up to the rear of the monastery? Why not announce your arrival, sit with Domhnall in the chapel? Osrith watched the little coracles, tubby, with high masts bob about their moorings with the swell of the waves. Where would she go if she took one, now? The nearest land was another island, Mile. She would have to cross that and sail further on to the mainland of Strathclyde. Strathclyde directly would leave her out in the sea far longer. It could barely be seen from here and she had little idea how to steer the craft, even if she was not anxious about the water. If ever she found Nine Fingers she would drown him as he had tried to drown her, tied to a rock in the face of an incoming tide. Her constant, elusive dream of meeting her brother was another possibility. But the monks on guard would probably loose arrows if the boats were touched. And besides, she had no silver, all she had was a waxcloth of herbs, some of the tansy and lily roots, some of the distant herb terebinth that Tagged had just pressed neat into wounds. They were her silver, Osrith thought, though she doubted many would be bribed with them. Mercifully, it wasn't long before Tagged was hurrying through the damp muddy earth and over the shingle, calling her. "We are to go together, now, all three of us. Domhnall is to see us." Osrith ran to him, and they strode quickly back through the monastery gate. Fergus was hurrying too. It was clear he, out of the two warriors, was worst for the previous night's sail, and he skidded in the mud, narrowly avoiding falling face first into it. Tagged led the way, across the stone slabs that led to the monastery's hall. The iron-worked oak door was closed, and Tagged beat on it, formally. It was Constantine who opened it, saying nothing to the three of them as he escorted them down the long corridor connecting them to the hall they had been in the night before. The room was lighter now. Candles were lit in two parallel rows leading to the open space ahead, in which a heavy carved wooden throne stood, its dark amber hue enhanced by its polished. Apart from the king sitting in it, the chair was about the majestic thing Osrith had ever seen. She looked again. No, it was no king sitting there, not yet. Deep blue robes fell about Domhnall's shoulders, and he was wearing a circlet of bronze on his long, black hair, decorated with interlocking knotted patterns reminding Osrith of the book so carefully taken by him, as bound parchments over to Malmuir, finished in the monastery of St. Patrick in Ardmukir. Domhnall mac Corstin ui Alpin looked magnificent. But, still, he was not yet king, despite Constantine and Domhnall standing either side of his throne as if counsellors. He would have to get to Dund, to be crowned king of the land. And Dund was at least 2 islands away, and it would be slow going with his stone brought from Tara. To the right of Constantine, Osrith saw, her stomach knotting at the sight, Grioghair stood, his neck wound caused by Osrith drawing Bué close to it illuminated in the light. "Welcome, my warriors." Domhnall beamed, holding out his arms wide and beckoning them forward. "You fought for me as I heard St. Comsil yesterday. My allies, Grioghair and his kin, have arrived with my possessions carefully taken under great personal risk from Dunnottar." Osrith looked at the throne again. Was this the same throne on which King Constantine's father once sat? She risked a glance at Constantine, but he stood impassive. Domhnall, however, glanced at Osrith and for a moment, turned his lips up into a brief smile. "With the Grioghair and his men, I am to move this day to Mile, whence to Grioghair's stronghold at Glenorchy." He rose and stepped from the throne, his rich velvet robe spilling out behind him. Domhnall truly looked as if he belonged on a throne, and looked as if he knew it, too. "I wish to honor you, for protecting my bodily person on the night last, and—" But before Domhnall could say much more, Osrith threw herself to her knees, cold stone meeting her thighs as she bent her head. "My lord king," Osrith declared, loud enough for all in the temporary throne room to hear. "For myself, may you keep your honor. Whilst defending you I did kill the kin of your ally, Grioghair mac Dungal." "My brother-in-law," Grioghair specified, rolling the words in his mouth, his voice soft. "I do humbly make my apology, lord." Osrith bowed her head to Domhnall. "I fought only to defend yourself and your royal cousins." "Ye killed Colleen," persisted Grioghair. She felt his eyes on her. But Domhnall waved a hand in Grioghair's direction. "You did your duty, Osrith," Domhnall said, stooping little, then holding out a hand to her. She took it, with her own strong right one as her left shoulder tingled from the strain, and he raised her to her feet. "You do deserve the honor. You." He stepped back, looking at his 3 fighters. "You 3 will be with me at Dund. You will witness my union with the land, with Constantine, with Domhnall and with Grioghair." He looked across to his ally. 3, thought Osrith. She looked at the king-elect, wondering whether Finolai was on his mind. But then Grioghair's strong, deep voice dissolved all thoughts of Domhnall's lover, her best friend. "But, Colleen," he protested. Domhnall raised his hand further higher. He will have a funeral this day, befitting his station. Osrith has expressed her regret for her party's death. Huh? Griogère repeated sharply, glaring at Osrith. She glanced at Constantine, who had shifted his weight briefly between feet. A woman? His eyes raked over her body. A warrior, Domhnall conferred. Osrith said nothing, but continued to look at her king. It was a shock to be reminded she was female, so used she was of being treated as a warrior. I wish you to accompany me as the abbot sends the good Colleen to rest, for never a finer warrior trod earth for you, Griogère. Domhnall turned, clapping his ally on the shoulder. Thanks to his efforts, we have means to get to Dund, and to fight.